Charles Darwin was born into a household where intellectual curiosity was not unusual, but quietly expected. His family belonged to England's educated elite, and from an early age he was surrounded by conversations that blended science, medicine, philosophy, and social responsibility. This environment did not push him toward a single path, but it trained him to observe carefully and to think without haste, habits that would later define his approach to the natural world. His father, Robert Darwin, was a successful physician whose rational outlook and practical intelligence left a deep impression on the household. Though stern in temperament, he valued careful judgment and empirical thinking, encouraging a respect for evidence rather than speculation. This atmosphere of measured reasoning shaped Darwin's mindset long before he encountered formal scientific debate, even if he did not yet recognize its importance. On his mother's side, Darwin inherited a different but equally influential legacy. The Wedgwood family, famous for their industrial innovation and progressive ideas, fostered a culture of reform, education, and moral inquiry. Though Darwin lost his mother at a young age, the intellectual and emotional tone of her family continued to influence him through close relatives who remained active in his upbringing. As a child, Darwin showed little interest in conventional schooling, but demonstrated a strong attraction to nature. He spent long hours collecting insects, observing animals, and exploring the countryside, often more engaged by small details than by formal lessons. These solitary pursuits were not guided by theory. They were instinctive acts of curiosity, revealing an early tendency to learn directly from experience. His early education exposed a tension between expectation and inclination. While his family initially imagined a traditional professional future for him, Darwin himself struggled with rigid academic structures. Yet this apparent lack of direction masked something deeper: an ability to absorb information slowly, reflect on it deeply, and retain impressions over long periods. An unusual trait in an era that prized quick mastery. By the time Darwin reached adolescence, his character was already marked by patience, attentiveness, and an openness to uncertainty. He was not driven by ambition in the usual sense, nor by a desire for public recognition. Instead, his early life quietly prepared him for a role that demanded endurance, humility, and the courage to follow evidence wherever it might lead, even when that path was not yet visible. From an early age, Darwin displayed a quiet but persistent fascination with the living world around him. While others saw fields, streams, and hedgerows as ordinary parts of the countryside, he treated them as places of discovery. Nature was not a backdrop to his childhood, but an active presence, inviting observation, comparison, and wonder. He was especially drawn to small details that most people overlooked. Insects, plants, stones, and shells captured his attention far more than toys or structured pastimes. He learned to notice differences in shape, colour, and behaviour, developing an instinct for careful observation long before he had the language to describe it scientifically. Darwin's curiosity was not driven by competition or display. He did not collect specimens to impress others, but because the act of collecting itself brought satisfaction. Each find raised new questions, rather than providing clear answers. This open-ended curiosity allowed him to remain patient, content with uncertainty rather than frustrated by it. Long walks in the countryside became moments of quiet exploration. During these solitary hours, Darwin learned to watch animals without disturbing them and to follow patterns in nature over time. Seasons, weather, and landscape changes slowly taught him that nature was dynamic, shaped by forces that operated gradually rather than suddenly. Books and stories about exploration and the natural world further fueled his imagination. They did not replace his direct experiences, but complemented them, helping him see his local surroundings as part of a much larger, interconnected world. Nature became, in his mind, something both intimate and vast. Darwin's formal education began to take shape when he entered the University of Edinburgh, a place known for its strong tradition in medical training. Officially, he was expected to prepare for a career in medicine, but the reality of lecture halls and surgical demonstrations quickly created distance between him and that path. The rigid structure of medical education failed to hold his attention, leaving him restless and intellectually unsatisfied. Despite his lack of enthusiasm for medicine, Edinburgh proved important in unexpected ways. Away from formal coursework, Darwin found himself drawn toward informal scientific circles, where natural history was discussed with passion and curiosity. These environments exposed him to debates about classification, marine life, and the study of organisms, offering a version of science that felt alive rather than mechanical. It was also during this period that Darwin encountered hands-on investigation in a serious way. He participated in field excursions and laboratory observations that emphasized direct engagement with nature. These experiences contrasted sharply with classroom instruction and quietly reinforced his preference for learning through observation rather than memorization. Recognizing that medicine was not a suitable future, Darwin's path shifted again when he moved to Cambridge. There, his studies were oriented toward theology, a discipline considered intellectually respectable and socially stable at the time. Cambridge offered a calmer atmosphere, one that allowed Darwin space to think, read, and reflect without the pressure of a narrowly defined professional identity. At Cambridge, his intellectual world expanded through personal connections, rather than lectures alone. He encountered mentors who encouraged him to take nature seriously as an object of study, not merely as a hobby. Through long conversations, shared walks, and guided reading, Darwin began to see how careful observation could be combined with broader philosophical questions. Darwin's attraction to natural history emerged not as a sudden passion, but as a steady pull toward understanding how the living world was organized. Rather than seeking dramatic discoveries, he became absorbed in patterns, how similar organisms differed slightly from one another, and how environments seemed to shape life in subtle ways. This quiet attentiveness distinguished his interest from casual curiosity. What fascinated him most was the idea that nature could be studied systematically. Plants, animals, and geological features appeared to follow underlying rules, even if those rules were not immediately clear. Darwin found satisfaction in careful description, classification, and comparison, developing a mindset that valued accuracy over speculation. He also began to appreciate the importance of time in nature. Landscapes did not appear fixed to him, they hinted at slow transformation. Fossils, rock layers, and variations among species suggested long histories, hidden beneath the surface of the present. These impressions planted early questions about change and continuity in the natural world. Darwin's interest deepened through exposure to collections and specimens. Museums, private cabinets, and academic collections offered him a way to see nature beyond his immediate surroundings. Examining preserved organisms encouraged him to think comparatively, recognizing both diversity and connection across different forms of life. Equally important was his growing respect for fieldwork. He learned that knowledge gained outdoors, through direct contact with nature, often revealed details that books could not capture. Weather, terrain, and animal behavior all resisted neat explanation, reminding him that nature was complex and resistant to simple answers. The voyage of HMS Beagle marked a decisive turning point in Darwin's life, transforming him from a curious observer into a disciplined naturalist, shaped by global experience. When the ship set sail, its mission was not scientific discovery in the modern sense, but surveying coastlines and improving navigation charts. Darwin joined the expedition without knowing that this journey would quietly redefine how he understood the living world. Life aboard the ship was demanding and often uncomfortable. Long stretches at sea tested patience and endurance, while isolation from familiar society forced Darwin into sustained reflection. Yet these conditions sharpened his focus. The slow rhythm of the voyage allowed him to think deeply, record meticulously, and develop a habit of sustained observation that would become central to his later work. Whenever the ship reached land, Darwin immersed himself in exploration. He examined unfamiliar landscapes, collected specimens, and recorded detailed notes on plants, animals, and geological formations. Each region presented forms of life adapted to local conditions, challenging the idea that nature followed a single, unchanging design. These encounters accumulated gradually, shaping his thinking without immediate conclusions. Geology played a particularly important role during the voyage. Rock formations, fossils, and signs of ancient environmental change suggested that the Earth itself had a long and active history. Darwin began to see landscapes not as static scenes, but as products of slow processes unfolding over immense spans of time. This perspective would later prove essential to how he understood biological change. The diversity of life Darwin encountered was striking, but it was variation within similarity that held his attention. Species that resembled one another, yet differed slightly from place to place, raised questions about origin and adaptation. These observations did not yet form a theory, but they unsettled simple explanations and encouraged him to think historically about nature. South America confronted Darwin with a scale and intensity of nature he had never experienced before. Vast plains, towering mountains, dense forests, and dramatic coastlines formed a landscape that felt alive and restless. Each region seemed governed by its own rules, encouraging Darwin to treat geography itself as a key to understanding life. As he travelled inland, Darwin closely examined the relationship between animals and their environments. He noticed how species were finely suited to local conditions. Climate, vegetation, and terrain shaping behaviour and form. These were not abstract ideas, but visible patterns, repeated again and again across different regions, quietly challenging simple explanations of life's distribution. Fossils found embedded in rock layers made a powerful impression. The remains of large, extinct animals appeared alongside living species that resembled them in form. This continuity between the past and present suggested connection rather than replacement, hinting that life might change gradually rather than appearing fully formed. These discoveries raised questions that Darwin carefully recorded without rushing to conclusions. The Andes offered a lesson in deep time. As Darwin crossed mountain passes and examined uplifted marine fossils high above sea level, he became increasingly aware that the Earth was shaped by slow, cumulative forces. Mountains, valleys, and coastlines were not fixed backdrops, but outcomes of long processes still at work. This understanding reshaped how he thought about permanence in both geology and biology. Encounters with local cultures also influenced his thinking. Indigenous knowledge of animals, plants, and landscapes revealed an intimacy with nature grounded in experience rather than theory. Darwin observed how human societies adapted to their environments, adding another layer to his growing sense that life, in all its forms, was shaped by conditions over time. When the expedition reached the Galapagos Islands, Darwin encountered a landscape unlike any he had seen before. Isolated, volcanic, and seemingly harsh, the islands felt unfinished, as if nature was still experimenting. This sense of incompleteness made every observation feel provisional, inviting questions rather than offering clear explanations. What struck Darwin first was the unusual familiarity mixed with difference. Animals resembled species from the South American mainland, yet they behaved differently and showed subtle changes in form. These were not dramatic transformations, but small variations that became more noticeable the longer he observed them. The islands appeared to preserve differences rather than erase them. The wildlife showed little fear of humans, allowing close study. Birds, reptiles, and mammals moved freely around him, revealing habits and traits that would have been impossible to observe elsewhere. This intimacy encouraged careful comparison between islands, between species, and between individuals of the same kind, living under slightly different conditions. One of the most revealing aspects was how each island seemed to host its own version of life. Similar animals occupied similar roles, yet their forms shifted from place to place. These patterns suggested separation and adaptation rather than randomness. Geography itself appeared to be shaping life, quietly and persistently. Darwin did not immediately grasp the full meaning of these observations. At the time, they registered as anomalies, details that did not quite fit established explanations. Yet he preserved them carefully in notes and specimens, sensing that their significance might only become clear later, when viewed as part of a larger whole. Darwin's return to England marked the end of physical travel, but the beginning of a far more demanding intellectual journey. After years of movement and observation, he now found himself surrounded by familiar landscapes that felt strangely altered. The world had not changed, but his way of seeing it had. What once appeared ordinary now seemed layered with hidden histories and unanswered questions. Settling back into English society required adjustment. The routines of daily life contrasted sharply with the intensity of exploration. Yet, they provided the stability Darwin needed to think. He began organizing his notes, specimens, and journals, a task that quickly revealed how vast and interconnected his observations had become. Patterns that were invisible in isolation began to emerge through comparison. Darwin entered a period of deep reflection rather than public declaration. He resisted quick conclusions, choosing instead to test his impressions against existing scientific knowledge. Reading, correspondence, and quiet analysis became his primary tools. This phase was marked not by confidence, but by hesitation and careful self-questioning. The sheer volume of material he had collected forced him to think systematically. Fossils, animals, plants, and geological observations all demanded explanation, yet no single framework seemed sufficient. Darwin began to suspect that nature operated through principles more flexible and dynamic than those commonly accepted, though he remained cautious about naming or defining them. Discussions with other scientists sharpened his thinking. Through private conversations and exchanged letters, Darwin encountered both support and skepticism. These interactions pushed him to clarify his ideas internally, even as he avoided presenting them publicly. Silence, for him, became a form of discipline rather than doubt. The development of natural selection did not emerge as a sudden revelation, but as a slow and often uneasy process of reasoning. Darwin approached the problem cautiously, aware that any explanation for the diversity of life would need to account for both stability and change. Rather than beginning with bold claims, he started by asking how small differences between individuals might matter over long periods of time. A crucial insight came from recognizing variation as a constant feature of living populations. No two individuals were exactly alike, even within the same species. Darwin began to see these differences not as imperfections, but as raw material, subtle traits that could influence survival and reproduction in specific environments. Nature, he realized, did not treat all variation equally. Equally important was the concept of competition. Resources were limited, and more individuals were born than could possibly survive. This imbalance suggested that life involved continual struggle, not necessarily dramatic conflict, but persistent pressure. Those organisms whose traits gave even a slight advantage were more likely to endure, leaving behind offspring that carried similar characteristics. Over time, Darwin connected these ideas into a coherent mechanism. Advantageous traits did not spread because they were ideal, but because they worked under particular conditions. Environments acted as silent filters, shaping populations generation after generation. Change, in this view, was gradual, cumulative, and deeply tied to local circumstances. Darwin tested these ideas relentlessly. He compared domesticated animals to wild species, studied breeding practices, and examined how small changes could be amplified across generations. This comparative approach strengthened his confidence that natural processes, rather than sudden creation, could explain complexity and adaptation. As Darwin's scientific ideas quietly matured, his personal life followed a more intimate and reflective path. He was not naturally inclined towards social display or emotional excess, and the question of marriage emerged for him as a practical and moral decision, rather than a romantic impulse. He weighed companionship, stability, and responsibility with the same seriousness he applied to scientific problems. Emma Wedgwood had been part of Darwin's life long before marriage entered his thoughts. A cousin and longtime acquaintance, she shared his background yet differed from him in temperament. Emma was deeply religious, emotionally perceptive, and socially grounded, qualities that contrasted with Darwin's reserved and analytical nature. This difference would become central to their relationship. Darwin approached the idea of marriage methodically, even listing the advantages and disadvantages in private notes. He considered the value of emotional support, shared domestic life, and intellectual companionship, but also worried about distractions from work and declining health. These reflections revealed a man seeking balance rather than passion, stability rather than excitement. Their marriage brought that balance into daily life. Emma provided a calm and structured household, allowing Darwin to work in a protected environment. She managed social obligations and family matters, quietly shielding him from pressures that might disrupt his focus. Her presence offered emotional steadiness, rather than intellectual rivalry. Despite their affection, differences in belief created moments of tension. Emma's faith and Darwin's growing scientific doubts did not always align, yet their relationship was marked by mutual respect rather than conflict. Emma worried about the spiritual consequences of Darwin's ideas, while Darwin remained sensitive to her concerns, choosing honesty over concealment in their correspondence. The years following Darwin's marriage were marked by intense intellectual labour carried out in relative seclusion. He withdrew from public scientific life not out of indifference, but from necessity. His work now demanded long periods of uninterrupted concentration, and he shaped his daily routine around careful reading, experimentation, and writing, often working in short, disciplined intervals. At the same time, persistent illness became a defining feature of his life. Symptoms varied in intensity and form, often leaving him exhausted and unable to travel or engage socially. Rather than halting his work, these limitations forced Darwin to adopt a slower, more methodical pace. Reflection replaced urgency, and patience became an essential part of his intellectual process. Isolation, however, did not mean disconnection. Darwin maintained an extensive network of correspondence, exchanging letters with scientists, breeders, and collectors across Europe and beyond. These written conversations allowed him to test ideas, gather evidence, and refine arguments without the strain of public debate. Letters became his laboratory, extending his reach far beyond his immediate surroundings. His home gradually transformed into a centre of quiet investigation. Experiments were conducted in gardens, greenhouses, and simple workspaces, focusing on plants, animals, and minute biological processes. Darwin paid close attention to small, repeatable observations, believing that truth emerged not from spectacle, but from accumulation. Despite the solitude, Darwin struggled with doubt. He questioned his own conclusions, worried about the reception of his ideas, and hesitated to move from private reasoning to public claim. Illness amplified these anxieties, reinforcing his tendency toward caution. Yet this very restraint strengthened his work, forcing him to demand clarity and evidence at every step. The decision to write On the Origin of Species emerged not from confidence but from pressure and responsibility. After decades of private research, Darwin realised that his ideas could no longer remain confined to notebooks and correspondence. The weight of accumulated evidence demanded expression, even as he remained deeply aware of how disruptive his conclusions might be. Darwin approached the writing process with extreme care. He did not aim to overwhelm readers with raw data, but to guide them step by step through a chain of reasoning. Every chapter was shaped to anticipate doubt, address objections, and lead the reader gradually toward conclusions that might otherwise seem unsettling. Clarity, not provocation, became his primary goal. The act of writing was physically and mentally taxing. Illness frequently interrupted his progress, forcing him to work in brief intervals. Yet these limitations reinforced his discipline. Each pause allowed him to reconsider phrasing, refine arguments, and remove anything that could be misinterpreted or overstated. The text grew slowly, shaped by restraint rather than urgency. Darwin was acutely aware that his audience extended beyond specialists. He wrote for educated readers who were curious but cautious, avoiding technical excess while preserving intellectual rigor. Examples drawn from everyday observation, breeding, variation, and natural processes served to ground abstract ideas in familiar experience. Emotionally, the writing process was marked by tension. Darwin understood that publication would expose his ideas to scrutiny, misunderstanding, and hostility. He worried about personal relationships, public reaction, and the broader consequences of challenging long-held beliefs. Despite this, he remained committed to intellectual honesty, refusing to soften conclusions simply to avoid controversy. When On the Origin of Species was finally published, it entered the public sphere quietly but decisively. There was no dramatic announcement, yet the book's arguments moved swiftly through intellectual circles. Readers immediately sensed that they were encountering not a speculative essay, but a carefully constructed challenge to established views of life and nature. The initial response was marked by intense curiosity. Scientists, scholars, and educated readers engaged with the work closely, recognizing the depth of evidence and the restraint of its tone. Even those who disagreed with Darwin acknowledged the seriousness of his approach. The book demanded to be answered, not dismissed. At the same time, controversy followed almost instantly. Many readers were unsettled by the implications of natural selection, particularly its suggestion that life developed through gradual processes, rather than fixed design. For some, the discomfort was scientific. For others, it was philosophical or moral. The book blurred boundaries that had long seemed secure. Public debate expanded rapidly beyond academic settings. Newspapers, reviews, and lectures turned Darwin's ideas into topics of general discussion. Supporters praised the explanatory power of the theory, while critics questioned its assumptions and feared its consequences. The intensity of the reaction revealed how deeply the book touched broader cultural beliefs. Darwin himself remained largely distant from these debates. Due to health and temperament, he avoided public confrontation, allowing others to defend or criticize the theory in open forums. This absence did not weaken the impact of the work. Instead, it emphasized that the ideas stood on their own, independent of personal persuasion. After the initial impact On the Origin of Species, Darwin did not consider his work complete. Instead, he treated the book as a foundation, an opening statement rather than a final word. His later writings aimed to strengthen, test, and expand evolutionary theory by applying it to specific aspects of life that demanded deeper explanation. One major direction of this work focused on variation within species. Darwin explored how traits were inherited, altered, and preserved across generations, even when their immediate usefulness was unclear. These investigations pushed him to confront complexity rather than simplicity, acknowledging that evolution did not always follow obvious or direct paths. Another significant expansion involved behavior and instinct. Darwin examined how actions that appeared purposeful or emotional could arise through gradual change rather than conscious design. By treating behavior as part of natural history, he extended evolutionary thinking beyond anatomy into the realm of psychology, an area few scientists of his time dared to approach systematically. Darwin also turned his attention to plants, using them as controlled systems for observing slow biological processes. Through meticulous experiments, he studied movement, reproduction, and sensitivity in organisms often considered passive. These studies reinforced his belief that life, in all its forms, responded actively to environmental pressures, even at the smallest scale. Perhaps most controversially, Darwin applied evolutionary reasoning to humanity itself. Rather than separating humans from nature, he examined them as part of it, shaped by the same forces as other organisms. This extension deepened resistance to his ideas, but also demonstrated their consistency. Evolution, in Darwin's view, was not selective in its reach. In the final years of his life, Darwin lived quietly, far from public debate, surrounded by family and familiar routines. His health remained fragile, limiting travel and social engagement. Yet his mind stayed active and observant. He followed scientific developments with interest, aware that ideas he had once guarded privately were now shaping discussions across disciplines. Darwin's death marked the passing of a figure who had transformed scientific thinking without seeking public authority. The decision to honour him with burial among Britain's most respected figures reflected a shift in how his work was perceived. What had once provoked discomfort and resistance was now increasingly recognised as a landmark in intellectual history. His legacy did not rest on a single book or theory, but on a method of thinking, Darwin showed that complex systems could be understood through patient observation, comparison, and evidence rather than assumption. This approach encouraged scientists to look for processes rather than fixed explanations, fundamentally altering how research questions were framed. In biology, his influence was profound and enduring. Fields such as genetics, ecology, and evolutionary biology developed within a framework that assumed change over time as a central principle. Even as new discoveries refined or expanded evolutionary theory, the core insight that life is shaped by natural processes acting over long periods remained intact. Beyond biology, Darwin's impact extended into psychology, anthropology, and even philosophy. By placing humanity within the natural continuum, he challenged ideas of separation between humans and the rest of life. This perspective reshaped debates about behavior, culture, and the origins of human traits, encouraging interdisciplinary approaches to understanding who we are. Today, Darwin's work is no longer seen as a disruption, but as a foundation. Modern science continues to revise, test, and expand evolutionary theory, yet it does so on ground he helped establish. His lasting contribution lies not only in what he explained, but in how he taught generations of thinkers to observe the natural world, with patience, humility, and a willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads.